December 17, 1944, 05:30 hours, Hounsveld, Belgium. The most powerful armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled for Hitler's last gamble sits motionless in the pre-dawn darkness. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers, all paralyzed, not by American firepower, not by tactical mistakes, by empty fuel tanks. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slams his fist against the turret hatch, the metallic clang echoing through the frozen Belgian forest. His driver, Unterscharführer Weber, attempts to restart the 700-horsepower Maybach engine one more time. Nothing. The fuel gauge reads empty. Herr Obersturmbannführer, Weber calls up from his compartment, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. The reserve tank is also dry. Peiper climbs down from his command tank, boots crunching on frozen soil. Around him, the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, sits like a museum display, immobile, impotent, dead. But then, through the morning mist, Peiper sees something that stops his heart. The abandoned American position ahead, Hounsveld, a supply depot for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans fled so quickly they left fires still burning in oil drums, coffee still hot in metal cups. And there, lined up like a gift from the gods of war themselves, stand rows upon rows of jerry cans, thousands of them, the distinctive olive-drab American fuel containers. Peiper approaches slowly, almost reverently. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Grühle, pries open one can and sniffs. Benzin, Herr Obersturmbannführer, high-octane gasoline. As his men begin the frantic work of refueling, Peiper walks among the stockpile, counting. The mathematics are staggering. 50,000 gallons, enough to fuel his entire Kampfgruppe for the push to the Meuse River, enough to potentially change the course of the offensive. The Americans abandoned more fuel in this single depot than most German divisions had received in the past 6 months. But as Peiper stands among this bounty, watching his men pour American fuel into German tanks, a crushing realization settles over him like the morning fog. A realization that will haunt him for the rest of his life. If the Americans can afford to abandon such quantities, if they can leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then this war is already over. Germany hasn't just miscalculated. Germany has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy. This is the story of how the richest prize in the Battle of the Bulge became the moment Germany realized it was fighting the impossible. How 50,000 gallons of captured fuel revealed an industrial might so vast it defied comprehension. And how one SS commander's greatest triumph became his most devastating defeat. Because what Joachim Peiper discovered at Hounsveld that frozen December morning wasn't just fuel. It was the mathematical proof that Germany never had a chance. If you find our content valuable, we kindly encourage you to support the channel by subscribing and liking the video. Now, let's return to the story. 6 months before Peiper's discovery, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, presented the Führer with a report that should have ended all offensive operations immediately. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The Luna Works, which produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April, managed only 5,000 tons by September. The Buna hydrogenation plants at Politz, Bleckhammer, and Brucks were operating at less than 10% capacity. The numbers told a story of inevitable defeat. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic production and captured Romanian fields, managed 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American production. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare with horse-drawn logistics, while America was drowning its armies in petroleum abundance. Major Friedrich Ziemann of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command calculated that the Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million gallons, but only half was actually delivered due to transportation problems and Allied bombing. The German High Command was betting the entire offensive on capturing enemy supplies, a strategy that revealed terminal weakness rather than strength. Think about that for a moment. Germany's last great offensive, the operation that was supposed to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, turning the tide of the war, was planned on the assumption that they would steal fuel from the enemy. They didn't have enough fuel to reach their objective. They were hoping to find it along the way. It's like starting a road trip from New York to Los Angeles with half a tank of gas and hoping to find abandoned vehicles to siphon from. Except the fate of an entire nation depended on this plan. Meanwhile, the Americans had constructed a petroleum pipeline system across France that the Germans couldn't even conceive of. Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, pumped fuel directly from Britain to France. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the front lines. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and receiving 1.4 million gallons. Read that again. They were consuming over 1 million gallons daily and still accumulating reserves while fighting. Joachim Peiper was not a fool. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, veteran of the Eastern Front, where he'd learned that in modern warfare, fuel was more precious than ammunition. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire Ardennes offensive, the spearhead that would punch through American lines and drive to the Meuse River, splitting the Allied armies in two. On December 14th, 2 days before the offensive began, Peiper attended the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was blunt. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse," he said, "if you capture American supplies." The fuel allocation for Kampfgruppe Peiper was 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles of combat operations. The distance to the Meuse was 65 miles. The mathematics of failure were built into the plan from the beginning, but no one dared say it out loud. As his column prepared to advance on December 16th, Peiper issued strict orders that reveal the desperation of Germany's position. Tanks would operate in single file to conserve fuel. Engines would be shut off during any halt longer than 5 minutes, and the capture of American fuel dumps was priority one, above even tactical objectives, above killing enemy soldiers, above seizing strategic positions. Find fuel, because without fuel, everything else was meaningless. The contrast with American operations that same morning could not have been starker. Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles from Peiper's starting position, recorded in his unit diary, quote, "Received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons, third delivery this week," end quote. Third delivery that week, storage already at capacity. The Americans had so much fuel they were running out of places to put it. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours. The German artillery barrage that opened Operation Watch on the Rhine used more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. But even this impressive display masked critical shortages. The shells were there, but the fuel to exploit the breakthrough wasn't. Peiper's column began moving at 7 a.m., already behind schedule. The roads, which on German maps appeared as highways, were narrow country lanes, many unpaved. Within hours, traffic jams developed as vehicles designed for the Russian steppes struggled through the Ardennes forest. At Lanzarote, Peiper's first objective, they encountered unexpected resistance from a single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. 18 men, 18 American soldiers who held up the most powerful German armored column for nearly 10 hours. During that delay, Peiper's vehicles sat idling, burning precious fuel they didn't have to spare. When they finally broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper's column had covered 20 miles and consumed 40% of their fuel. At this rate, they would run dry before reaching the halfway point to the Meuse. The offensive was failing before it had really begun. The American supply depot at Hansfeld wasn't even a primary facility. It was a forward supply point for the 99th Infantry Division, with the U.S. Army classified as a Class 3B depot, a temporary fuel station, the kind of place you'd stop to top off your tanks before moving to the real fight. Yet what Peiper found there exceeded the monthly fuel allocation for an entire German panzer division. Hauptsturmführer Hans Grühle later testified, quote, We found pyramids of jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of gasoline. They were stacked 3 meters high, extending for perhaps 200 meters. The Americans had not even attempted to destroy them." End quote. The captured fuel was high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with motor fuel, 80 octane or higher. German vehicles, especially the temperamental Maybach engines in the Tiger tanks, were designed for 74 octane fuel. The American gasoline was actually too good. It caused engine problems in several German vehicles. Think about that irony. Germany's fuel was so poor quality that when they captured American fuel, it was too high quality for their engines. As Peiper's men refueled, they made more discoveries, each one more devastating than the last. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann found shipping manifests in the depot office. He could read English, having worked in his father's import business before the war. The papers indicated this fuel had been shipped from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, and trucked 400 miles to Hounsfeld. The journey of over 6,000 miles had taken less than 6 weeks. Quote, "I showed the papers to Obersturmbannführer Peiper," Hoffmann recalled in a 1976 interview. "He read them twice, then crumpled them up. He said nothing, but his face went pale." End quote. What did it mean? It meant the Americans could move fuel halfway around the world faster than Germany could move it 50 miles. It meant American logistics operated on a scale that made German operations look medieval. Private Ernst Krag found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would use in the entire offensive. To comprehend the shock of Peiper's discovery, you need to understand Germany's fuel situation by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing had reduced synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft for lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training had been cut from 250 flight hours to 60 hours. German pilots were going into combat with less training than American crop dusters. The German Navy's surface fleet had effectively ceased operations. U-boats were fitted with snorkels to conserve diesel by running on batteries longer. On the home front, German civilians hadn't seen private automobile traffic since 1942. Gasoline was so precious that the Gestapo investigated black market theft of individual leaders. Farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows. Germany was literally going backward in time while America raced forward. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were operating at such capacity that Standard Oil was experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because they had excess crude. They had so much oil they were inventing new things to do with it. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Hounsfeld, Peiper's column surged forward. They reached Bullingen by noon on December 17th, capturing additional supplies, rations, ammunition, and most importantly, maps showing other American fuel depots in the area. But the maps revealed a disturbing truth that made Peiper's blood run cold. The Americans had fuel stockpiles everywhere. Every major crossroads had a depot. Every town had reserves. The U.S. First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons in reserve. 3.5 million gallons. Just sitting there, waiting. The abundance was incomprehensible. Peiper pushed on to Ligneville, where his forces would commit the Malmedy massacre, killing 84 American prisoners. Even this war crime was connected to fuel desperation. Peiper later claimed he couldn't spare gasoline to transport prisoners to the rear. Whether that's true or just an excuse for atrocity, it reveals how fuel shortage influenced every decision, every calculation, every crime. By evening on December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached Stavelot, site of a major American fuel depot containing over 2 million gallons. 2 million gallons. Here was enough fuel to guarantee reaching the Meuse, enough to complete the mission, enough to potentially change the course of the war. But as the first German vehicles approached the outskirts of town, American engineers were already at work, and what they were about to do would shatter any remaining German illusions about this war. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received warning of the German approach. His orders were simple, brutally simple. Deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. The Stavelot depot contained 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline in jerry cans stacked across 15 acres. 15 acres of fuel. At 16:30 hours on December 17th, as Peiper's advance guard approached, Captain Brewster gave the order. Engineers poured gasoline trails between the stacks. White phosphorus grenades were distributed. Technical Sergeant Paul Hinkle threw the first grenade. Quote, "The explosion was immediate and tremendous," he recalled. A wall of fire shot up maybe 100 feet. End quote. Peiper's lead tanks arrived to find a pillar of black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the winter sky. The fire would burn for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to have powered Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back, with reserves left over. Unterscharführer Weber described the scene, and his words capture the moment Germany's last hope died. Quote, "The Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank turret watching the flames. He said nothing for perhaps 5 minutes, just stood there, perfectly still, watching millions of gallons burn. Then he climbed down and told me, 'They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us.'" End quote. What are we doing here? That question, asked by one of Germany's most elite commanders at the spearhead of Germany's last offensive, tells you everything you need to know about December 1944. Peiper had just witnessed the Americans casually destroy more fuel than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. They burned it, set it on fire, turned 2 million gallons into smoke rather than risk it falling into German hands. The psychology of that is staggering. You only destroy resources that casually, if you have unlimited more where that came from. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were destroying fuel dumps rather than risk capture. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. In total, Americans deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons during the first week of the offensive. 8 million gallons. More than Germany had allocated for the entire operation, more than most German armies received in 6 months, just burned, turned into smoke, because the Americans could afford to. The ability to casually destroy millions of gallons was rooted in a supply system beyond German comprehension. The Red Ball Express had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks operating round the clock. Each truck consumed 40 gallons daily. Think about that. The operation to supply American forces burned more fuel than German Army Group B received monthly. Just the trucks delivering supplies consumed more fuel than an entire German Army group. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service employed 230 truck companies operating on color-coded routes: Red Ball Express, White Ball Express, Green Diamond Express. The system delivered 20,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of fuel, every single day. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for 1st Army, recorded on December 18th, quote, "Fuel receipts yesterday, 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 1,623,000 gallons." End quote. Net gain. While fighting the largest German offensive since 1940, while under attack by Hitler's best remaining divisions, the Americans were accumulating fuel reserves. They were using over 1.5 million gallons per day and still building stockpiles. The pipeline system was even more impressive, even more impossible by German standards. Operation Pluto had laid pipes across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain to France. A network of pipelines extended inland like a massive circulatory system. The Cherbourg-Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons daily. The Seine line moved 650,000 gallons. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons daily, while receiving 8.2 million gallons, building reserves during offensive operations. While fighting, the Germans could barely comprehend numbers that large. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the impossibility of the German position became mathematically clear. At Cheneux, they captured another depot, 5,000 gallons, consumed in 3 hours of combat. Tiger tanks consumed 2.5 gallons per mile in battle. Panthers burned 1.5 gallons per mile. In the difficult Ardennes terrain with constant acceleration and deceleration, consumption increased by 40%. They were bleeding fuel faster than they could capture it. Hauptmann Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded with Germanic precision the numbers that told the story of Germany's defeat. Quote, "By noon on December 18th, we had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. We had captured perhaps 55,000 gallons." End quote. Operating at a deficit. Every mile forward was a mile they wouldn't be able to retreat. Every engagement burned fuel they'd never replace. They were driving deeper into Belgium knowing they'd never have enough fuel to drive back out. The Americans, monitoring German radio traffic through ultra-intercepts, knew Peiper's fuel situation. They were reading his desperate messages requesting resupply. General Courtney Hodges ordered all units, quote, "enemy critically short of fuel," end quote. That same day, December 18th, American C-47s flew 316 sorties, delivering supplies to surrounded Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans were flying more fuel to a surrounded garrison than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed. They were airdropping fuel by the hundreds of thousands of gallons, while the Germans scraped for thousands. By December 19th, as Peiper's forces engaged defenders at Stoumont, the fuel crisis had become terminal. Tanks were being abandoned with empty fuel tanks rather than from battle damage, not destroyed by American shells, just out of gas. Peiper consolidated his remaining fuel, perhaps 8,000 gallons, into his most critical vehicles, enough for one engagement or retreat, but not both. He would have to choose. Meanwhile, Allied planners were preparing for January operations with a casualness that would have seemed obscene to German officers. Brigadier General Morris Gilland requested 245 million gallons for the coming month. The request was approved without discussion, without debate, without anyone suggesting it was impossible. Just approved, because America could produce it. The contrast extended beyond quantity to quality and standardization. American vehicles were designed for logistical efficiency. Sherman tanks consumed 0.8 gallons per mile versus the Tiger's 2.5. American trucks got 8 miles per gallon fully loaded. Parts were interchangeable. Maintenance was simplified. You could swap engines between vehicles. German forces operated a bewildering array of captured and manufactured vehicles with different fuel requirements. French tanks needed different oil than German Panthers. Soviet trucks required different parts than German Opels. Captured American vehicles needed American fuel, which performed poorly in captured French vehicles. Each complication multiplied logistical difficulties. Every non-standard vehicle made the impossible even more impossible. On December 20th, Peiper received a radio message that ended any hope of completing the mission. Quote, "Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft, no resupply possible," end quote. Continue with available resources. They had perhaps enough fuel for 20 kilometers of combat operations. The Meuse was 30 kilometers away. The mathematics were simple and brutal. They couldn't reach their objective. Peiper called his commanders together in a farmhouse at La Glaise. Sturmbannführer Werner Poetschke was blunt in a way only Germans facing certain defeat could be. Quote, "We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away." End quote. According to Hauptsturmführer Grulla's post-war testimony, Peiper's response revealed how completely the scales had fallen from German eyes. Quote, "The Obersturmbannführer said, 'Gentlemen, we have discovered we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we receive for this entire operation. What we captured at Hunsfeld, which seemed miraculous, was nothing to them.'" End quote. Let that sink in. One of Germany's most elite commanders, at the spearhead of Germany's last great offensive, with some of the best soldiers in the Wehrmacht, surrounded by the finest tanks Germany could produce, admits defeat. Not because they'd been outfought, because they'd been outproduced. This realization was spreading through the German ranks like a virus of despair. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, quote, "When I learned Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive had failed before it began." End quote. Colonel Friedrich von der Heide, captured December 23rd, told his interrogators something that American intelligence found more valuable than any tactical information. Quote, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" End quote. How can you fight infinity? That's what it felt like to German soldiers in December 1944. They were fighting infinity. By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded at La Glaise, his tanks immobile from lack of fuel, not damaged, not destroyed, just empty. The American forces surrounding him, the 30th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, 3rd Armored, had a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons for December 21st alone. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons remaining. Private First Class Richard McKinney of the 30th Infantry wrote home with the casual tone of a man who doesn't understand how extraordinary his situation is. Quote, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for their tanks." End quote. It did seem funny. If you didn't understand how desperate Germany had become, how completely their logistics had collapsed, how they'd gambled everything on one last throw of the dice and come up snake eyes. The American response to the German offensive demonstrated industrial warfare at its absolute peak. Patton's Third Army pivoting north to relieve Bastogne required 350,000 gallons just for redeployment, just to move the army into position. Germans considered this impossible. Patton accomplished it in 3 days. December 23rd brought clear weather after a week of fog and snow. Allied aircraft flew 2,000 sorties that single day. Each P-47 Thunderbolt consumed 300 gallons per hour of flight. B-26 Marauders burned 200 gallons per hour. One day's air operations consumed more fuel than Germany's entire offensive allocation. One day, 1,940,000 gallons burned by aircraft alone. Germany's entire Ardennes operation was allocated 5 million gallons, and half of that wasn't delivered. The Americans burned nearly 2 million gallons in a single day of air operations and didn't even notice the expense. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, with American forces closing in and no fuel for breakout or defense, Peiper made the only decision left to him: abandon everything, walk out. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that began the offensive, 39 remained operational, but immobilized. Operational, but immobile. Perfect machines rendered useless by empty fuel tanks. Obergefreiter Heinz Goltz described the scene with the matter-of-fact tone of a man witnessing something unbelievable. Quote, "We drained the last fuel from all vehicles, maybe 200 gallons total. The Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his command tank. We placed charges in the engine compartment and transmission." End quote. Millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of hours of skilled labor, years of industrial production, Germany's finest tanks, destroyed by their own crews because they had no fuel. Of 5,000 men who began with Kampfgruppe Peiper, approximately 770 returned to German lines. They had advanced 60 miles into Belgium, captured several fuel depots, killed hundreds of Americans, and discovered the truth about Allied logistics that would haunt them forever. News of Peiper's discoveries spread rapidly through German command, and the psychological impact was devastating. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received detailed reports on captured American supplies and what had been destroyed at Stavelot. His chief of staff recorded Model's reaction with Germanic precision. Quote, "The field marshal read the quantities twice, as if he couldn't believe the numbers. 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed rather than captured." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We are not fighting the same war." Yeah. End quote. Hitler, informed on December 28th, refused to accept reality with the willful blindness that characterized his entire leadership. Speer wrote in his diary, quote, "Hitler insisted the numbers were propaganda. When shown photographs of burning Stavelot, he claimed it was Hollywood trickery." End quote. But the lower ranks understood. They saw it with their own eyes. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife in a letter that somehow escaped censorship. Quote, "Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks like we once drove bicycles, casually, without concern." This war is lost." End quote. The fuel crisis was symptomatic of a larger, more fundamental truth about industrial warfare in the 20th century. By 1944, America produced 50% of global manufacturing output. 50%. Half of everything manufactured on Earth came from American factories. A new aircraft every 5 minutes, a ship launched daily, a tank completed every 7 minutes. The production statistics were so overwhelming they ceased to have meaning. United States petroleum production, 1.8 billion barrels in 1944. Soviet Union, 110 million barrels. Germany, including synthetic production in Romanian oil, 33 million barrels. Japan, 2.6 million barrels. Do that math. The Axis powers combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum, less than 2%. This wasn't a war. It was industrial annihilation with a 24 to 48-month delay. Every major German offensive after 1942 had been constrained by fuel shortages. Every American offensive was supported by abundance German planners couldn't even conceive of. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen, aide to General Omar Bradley, recorded a revealing incident on December 27th that captures this disconnect perfectly. Quote, "A logistics officer reported with concern that bad weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons daily. There was momentary alarm until someone pointed out this exceeded Germany's total offensive allocation. We all laughed." End quote. A bad day for American logistics was a catastrophic victory for German logistics. That's the war in one sentence. German prisoners of war from the Ardennes were interviewed extensively, and American intelligence officers discovered something fascinating. The prisoners were more shocked by American waste than by American firepower. Seeing GIs discard half-eaten rations shattered morale more than artillery barrages. Using gasoline to heat water for shaving made German soldiers question everything they'd been told about American weakness. Oberstleutnant Gustav Knittel told his interrogators, quote, "We knew your production numbers abstractly, as statistics, but seeing your soldiers waste more than we possessed, seeing them discard food we would treasure, made those numbers real. Every German who saw your casual abundance knew the war was hopeless. It wasn't the fighting that broke us." End quote. The waste broke them. Because waste implies infinite abundance. You only waste what you have too much of. This knowledge spread through letters home despite censorship. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote in a letter discovered in 2003, quote, "Americans wash their vehicles with gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery for Christmas celebrations. We cannot fight infinity. We cannot defeat waste." End quote. End. The psychological impact of American abundance undermined every Nazi narrative about racial superiority and Aryan destiny. How could decadent Americans possess such wealth while the master race scraped for necessities? How could a mongrel democracy outproduce the organized might of the Third Reich? Every jerry can at Hansfeld was a refutation of everything the Nazis believed. During the Nuremberg trials, German leaders consistently cited logistics, particularly fuel shortages, as the decisive factor in Germany's defeat, not tactics, not courage, not even Allied military superiority. Logistics. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel testified, quote, "We had operational superiority in 1940 and 1941. By 1944, we couldn't move forces for lack of fuel, while Americans moved entire armies like chess pieces." End quote. Joachim Peiper, tried for the Malmedy massacre, offered testimony during his defense that revealed how fuel shortage influenced even war crimes. Quote, "Every decision after December 17th was influenced by fuel shortage. We couldn't maneuver, couldn't pursue advantages, couldn't retreat when necessary. Americans moved freely while we counted leaders." End quote. He was convicted anyway, imprisoned until 1956. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German blitzkrieg doctrine, wrote in his memoirs with remarkable honesty, quote, "When Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, and it meant everything to him but nothing to Americans who destroyed millions, I knew the war was over. Not tactically, mathematically." End quote. A war of arithmetic. That's exactly what World War II had become by 1944, and Germany was on the wrong side of every equation. The story resonates decades later because it represents the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion. when wars were decided by production statistics rather than warrior courage. The romantic notion of warfare, where individual heroism and tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantage, died in the Ardennes among rows of empty fuel tanks. Dr. Richard Overy, the British historian, calculated that by 1944, Allied to Axis production ratios exceeded 5-to-1 in every major category. In petroleum, it approached 50-to-1. These advantages couldn't be overcome by superior training, better tactics, or even more advanced weapons. The mathematics were final. America produced 324,750 aircraft during the war. Germany built 119,097. Americans produced 88,410 tanks. Germany manufactured 46,857. But most tellingly, most definitively, America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone, while Germany, with all its synthetic plants and Romanian fields, scraped together 33 million barrels for the entire war's remainder. December 24, 1944, Christmas Eve. As Peiper's men slipped through American lines on foot, abandoning 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the magnitude of what they'd learned crystallized with painful clarity. Unterscharführer Weber reflected in a 1975 interview, his voice still carrying the shock of that revelation. Quote, "That morning at Hansfeld, finding American fuel, we celebrated like we'd won the lottery. We danced, we embraced. We thought maybe, just maybe, we could still win this." By evening, after learning about stavload burning, after understanding they'd destroyed millions of gallons, we knew we'd already lost. Americans had so much they could destroy what we'd die to possess. That's when I knew, really knew. End quote. The 50,000 gallons Peiper captured at Hansfeld was less than a single American armored division consumed in 2 days of operations. Less than the Red Ball Express burned in 3 hours of deliveries, a rounding error in Allied daily consumption. It was simultaneously the largest fuel capture of the German offensive and completely meaningless in the larger context of American logistics. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7 Corps, later wrote with the casual confidence of a man backed by infinite resources, quote, "Germans' desperate attempts to capture our fuel revealed their fundamental miscalculation. They assumed we valued fuel as they did, as irreplaceable, as precious. They couldn't comprehend we had so much we could burn millions of gallons rather than risk minor tactical disadvantage." End quote. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Battle of the Bulge, failed through the immutable mathematics of industrial warfare. The offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons of fuel, 60% from their allocation, 40% from captured supplies. During the same period, Americans consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more.